Hey, deserving listeners, it's time for part 5 in which I react to the Shayne interview on YouTube. Let's watch. From Love is Blind. Let's watch.
I think that's probably the number one mistake people make in relationships.
That's exactly what I made.
Is they're just like, but when it's good, it's so good. But like, at the end of the day, if you take an inventory of how you feel overall in the relationship, like your resting state of being around this person, do you feel confident or insecure? Do you feel happy or do you feel sad? Do you feel calm or do you feel anxious?
Okay, so they're continuing this conversation about toxicity, and Nick is providing his own philosophy that his philosophy that people often stay in relationships too long because there are some good sides, and the individual will go into denial about the bad side, the toxic side, if you will, as they're calling it. And okay, yeah, I mean, it depends, right? For some people, they are, because of their relational traumas, triggered so often in a healthy relationship that if they just went off their feelings, they would never be in a relationship. So it's hard to tell. Is it a good thing to consider when you're in a relationship? And is it a good questioning series to go down? Yes, what he's talking about, how do you feel? This is important, so that's the other side, is that you'll have people, because of relational traumas, they won't even really know how they feel, or they will discount how they feel. They might have been in a relationship, an abusive relationship, where they were gaslit for 3 years and actually don't trust how they feel, and thus will endure a relationship much longer than they should or would otherwise if they were in touch with their feelings. Yeah, absolutely. But this blanket notion that somehow if in a relationship there are bad feelings, and how do we gauge how much bad? And these are questions that people will ask me. They'll be in a relationship and they'll be in this state where it's like, oh, there's some bad things about this relationship, but there's a lot of good things, and the bad things aren't that bad. But at what point is it bad enough that you're supposed to leave a relationship? And there is no right answer to that question. It's a matter of exploration. It's a matter of trying to understand your own lens. A big part of our inability to see relationships accurately, so to speak, is our past traumas imposing lenses that are biased or overreactive or even in denial of certain things. And so once you evaluate that and you work on that and remove that as a barrier to you seeing a situation accurately or effectively, then you're much more likely to have a decision that is more conducive to your needs and the other person's needs. So it's complicated, but somehow this blanket statement of just, if you ever have bad feelings in a relationship, or if you're, because another part of this is all of us in the best of relationships. Well, I'll just talk about myself. I consider my marriage with my wife to be good, and there are issues, but it's good. And I don't ever question it. I've never questioned my relationship with her. I've never thought, should I be with someone else? But there are times when there's conflict, and in those moments, for a time, I am pretty negative. I am really upset. I'm really hurt, and I will think thoughts that are, if I went with them, very destructive. Especially thoughts like, it's all her fault. It's not my fault, right? And I have those feelings at times, and if I were to be asked questions along these lines, I'd be like, well, yeah, I mean, there's all these horrible things, and but that's just the nature of being in a relationship. You can't get away from that. We're human beings. We're not robots, and we have just goo between our ears that isn't a very precise instrument of objective reality. And so now, for some people, though, they might have a fair amount of conflict, and they might frequently feel negative and questioning the relationship or bad about themselves because of what's happening in the relationship. And at what point should you jump ship? It's hard to tell.
ADHD of naturally anxious person, but like ideally you want to be with someone who brings that anxiety down, not builds it up.
That's
and
true.
I'm fortunate enough to be in a relationship now with someone who, oh my God, like my anxiety is 100 times better around her. And I've been in relationships where that feeling of not being good enough and always doing something.
Good. So Nick is contrasting a relationship he's in now with with past relationships and noticing how he feels. He's framing it anxiety. I wonder what he means by that. Maybe anxiety of attachment loss, I'm guessing. So that is a good measure of how frequently do I feel anxious because of them, triggered because of them, hurt because of them, angry at them. How often do I have those kinds of feelings? That is something to think about. But again, just to say that if you ever have those feelings, you should leave that person. Like I said, you would never be in a relationship otherwise.
Sometimes I'll look like, did I say something wrong? Is she going to be mad at me? Because I still have PTSD from like past relationships where I think this would have caused a fight.
Good. He's able to talk about that, and that shows good emotional intelligence and vulnerability, and that he's able to share that. His usage of PTSD is an issue that I guess I should briefly discuss. I don't know if I've ever talked about this, but I see it a lot. And I've actually been guilty of doing this myself. So when so what he's talking about is he's been in past relationships where he was micromanaged and criticized or belittled or something when he was in public, and he wouldn't have a filter. And so he'll say something and he'll be like, oh, did I just cross a line? He'll turn to his current partner and she won't have a reaction. And he's just like, why do I assume that she's going to yell at me? I'm like already cringing. It must be because of my past relationships. It's because of PTSD. That's not PTSD. It's possible to have PTSD from that, but the way he phrased it, it didn't sound like the full-blown disorder. PTSD is a very complicated disorder. You have to have a fair amount of symptoms to qualify for the diagnosis. So I'll just say that. In fact, I believe, in terms of just my own survey of our diagnostic manual is, I don't know, 800 pages or something, and it's pretty dense, and there's a lot of diagnoses in there, and PTSD is the longest. It has the longest. It's like 2 or 3 pages of symptoms that are available to look at in terms of endorsing, in terms of applying the label of PTSD. I phrased that weird, but anyway. So, however, you could say you have a trauma reaction, which I wish people would say, because to just say, oh, I have PTSD because of a past relationship where I was criticized, but it is akin to PTSD. You could claim it's like extremely mild. Well, some people would argue against that, but the way to think about it, the way that I think about it, as Nick is describing it, is when he would cross a line verbally in public, and he would just be la-di-da, blah, 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 and then all of a sudden, boom, he would get this attack, and it would feel scary. So PTSD is a condition that is the result of terror, when we have extreme spikes in distress and fear and anxiety. And without that, you can't really have PTSD. So when you have that, it's a tiny little bit. It's not like seeing your friend get shot and killed right next to you, or being chronically beaten and worried you're going to be killed by your father when you're a child. It's not to that degree, and it doesn't produce the same level of terror, but it is a slight little bit of terror, right? You say something in public, you're crossing the line, your partner looks at you or kicks you under the table, or scowls at you, and it's a shot to your system, to your nervous system. And that's a fear response, and that's a normal, good response, because when we bother people, when other people are angry at us, it's functional to be a little afraid of that, because it's like, oh, and then when we feel that fear, we take note of, oh, I need to not do that because I don't like this feeling, and I also don't like pissing other people off. But when you are chronically and perhaps unfairly treated that way, and he says he has ADHD as well, so this could go back to when he was young and being impulsive and then suddenly getting someone's anger at him, that he has this association with speaking freely in public, that he can feel it in his body. Usually when people are talking about PTSD in this colloquial way, in this layperson way, they're referring to like a physical, like, ugh, you can feel it in your body. And it is akin if you, for example, you did this behavior in public and then your partner did something like put a gun to your head or whatever, some kind of extreme behavior over time, or on the way home they beat you or something, that you would have a lot more terror, right? You would have a lot of terror, and thus your symptoms might rise to the level or to the specificity of PTSD. So it's on the spectrum, but it's so low. I wish that people wouldn't say just PTSD or even mild PTSD. What the phrase that I use is a trauma reaction. That's an available phrase that there's no exact clinical range that is applied for. So you had, and the word trauma sometimes is thrown around a little bit, but I consider, in my language system, I think it's totally fine to use that. You're sitting there, you do something, someone is angry at you, it's kind of scary to your system. You're like, oh, and then, who knows what you do after that? You might get real defensive or whatever. But that initial response of like, I do A, and then B happens, and then C is how I feel, and then all that gets wrapped up and associated, and then the next time you do it, your body is trained to have a fear response even if there isn't B. You have A, and then it goes straight to C, even without B. So that's essentially what PTSD is, and then there's this cascade of problems that happen because of that chronic feeling where you start to distance yourself from other people. You are hypervigilant. You might avoid emotions because there's all these other problems that happen as a way of trying to internally cope with that reality. Someone goes to war, they see a lot of violence, they hear helicopters, they come back to the United States, they hear a helicopter, and so in war there was A, the helicopter, B, gunshots and possible death, and C, terror. So it all gets associated. When they come home, they see a helicopter, A, they don't need to go to B, they just go straight to C. It's just like, ugh. And if you have that in war chronically, someone can develop absolute, they will rise potentially to the threshold of PTSD where they qualify, and it's awful, right? And then there's all the problems that I won't go into right now that I briefly talked about earlier. So what Nick is talking about, I would call a trauma reaction, akin to PTSD, but definitely not PTSD unless he could convince me otherwise.
And I just don't have that with my current girlfriend. So like, and that matters. It just doesn't matter how good the sex is or how good they are or how thoughtful they are on your birthday. If like the day-to-day makes you feel belittled and small.
Yeah. It makes sense. I mean, I was the opposite way of thinking that. Yeah. Because I always kept telling her, like, we have such good times. We have such good times. And that's also why we've reconnected 4 times after the show.
Well,
we tried 4 times.
Four times.
Interesting. I think we knew once, but 4 times they tried. What does that mean? They tried and then, no, this isn't going to work. Then they tried, no, this isn't going to work. And that's interesting. It's not uncommon to do that. People tend to look down on that as like, what are you doing? But, breakups are messy, as I say.
Be spiteful and hate and whatnot. It's like,
if she listens to this podcast,
she's going to hate. Yeah, but guess what? I had some things that happened in the last couple of days where it's like, I'm fed up with it now. It's like you can't.
Do you think she's going to be surprised? Have you told her everything you were telling us?
Yeah. So because she knows a lot of stuff.
It sounds like they had an agreement to be cordial and also be nice to each other in interviews because they wisely previously decided that wouldn't be good for either one of them, which is totally true. I mean, just imagine one of your breakups in your past is watched by millions of people and you're interviewed directly after several times. I mean, I'm just going to take a guess and say that Shayne, years from now, will even possibly look back at this interview and think like, oh, I shouldn't have said that about Natalie. That I don't even really think that anymore. We just went through another, because it sounds like he's on the heels of yet another breakup, their 5th breakup. And yeah, so that's not good to hear. But I will say that I don't know if Shayne said anything that is that derogatory or hurtful to Natalie. I mean, at least I would hope that people hearing Shayne would be like, well, I'm sure there's another side to that story. But maybe people don't think that. Maybe people don't do that. And if that's the case, then yeah, it is pretty uncool for Shayne to do this. I mean, he's basically saying throughout this whole interview that she was super into impression management, meaning she was being fake in front of the cameras often, that she was a jerk face behind the scenes, criticizing him frequently. That whole story, the big blow up before the wedding when he was, according to him, very intoxicated, and according to him, she was just yelling at him about being intoxicated. I'm sure there's more to that story. I'm just gonna take a guess and say that Natalie didn't walk in at the bachelor party, see him super intoxicated and having fun, and then just lay into him because he happens to be intoxicated. I'm just going to take a guess that he did something, said something to bother her, probably multiple things, and she was trying to be nice. She's at a party, and then eventually said something. Who knows? I don't know. Could she be somewhat to blame for having tone or laying into him inappropriately? Sure, I could see that. But would we characterize it as Shayne did nothing to provoke that criticism from her? I don't know. It just doesn't seem very likely. So yeah, that's upsetting. I mean, just imagine that you have this agreement with someone, and it's like a truce. We both win if we keep this truce. Well, actually, a very common scenario, much more common than reality TV, is when you go through a divorce and you have kids. This is a very important truce that you have with your partner, is we will not ridicule each other or criticize each other around the kids. If I have a criticism about you that I need to vent about, I'll talk with my therapist, my parents, my friends. I will not talk with my kids, and I won't let them hear that stuff because it will totally infect their relationship with you. And it'll start this arms race, where I'm trying to get my kids to think I'm the better one, and then you're trying to do that, and everyone loses, particularly the kids. And imagine, and I'm sure some of you can because you've been through this, is your partner doesn't honor that truce, and then what do you do? And I've been there with families. And by the way, the general advice I give is don't lower yourself, because there's really no way to win. I mean, there's little things you might be able to do, like if the kids are saying, Daddy says that you cheated on him or something, and it's hard not to say something. So there are certain things you can say, like, well, our relationship was pretty complicated, and by the way, I don't think any of us should be talking about that with you. Some general things. But the general advice that I have is that you don't lower yourself, because one, if your partner is damaging the situation, you adding more damage doesn't lower the damage, it just makes more damage. It's hard to watch that because you don't have any control over it. You're trying to reach out and say, hey, don't say those things. So that's one. Number two is, if you don't lower yourself, then you have a greater chance of your partner realizing that they're in the wrong and will stop. So it might just be a temporary thing. The other thing, number three, is that even though the kids might be kind of influenced by a manipulative co-parent, usually over time the kids will wise up and say, oh, I think that parent is actually the bad parent, or being unfair and being immature or whatever. And the parent who has not been making their case with me and not lowering themselves, I feel better around. And so you can't always bank on that honesty, because there can be high degrees of manipulation in a co-parent. So it's rough, but at the very least, there's a general principle of don't lower your, at least impulsively don't lower yourself until you really think like what you're going to say to your kids is actually going to help. And there's almost always an impulse to do that with parents. There's almost always an impulse to have your kids understand what you went through. And, you know, like if you were in a car accident or something, or I don't know, you were on a walk and a bear came out at you and you ran away. You get home, you know, there's an impulse to share it with people, maybe even your kids. And I get that impulse, but it is highly destructive because kids need to believe in both of their parents. Now there are extreme situations where the other parent is beyond the pale in terms of abusive, and then kind of there's a whole other, you know, set of principles that follow for that. But, you know, barring that, you need to, kids need to believe that their parents are good, or of the flaws that they see, we want to minimize that as much as possible. The other thing that kids often need is they need people to get along, not because they're concerned about you, but because they're concerned about themselves. If they see you, bad mouthing your other partner, your kids have learned a very, very important lesson, which is both of my parents, when push comes to shove, will not only reject someone close to them, but they will attack them verbally behind their back, because they apply it to themselves. Kids are always applying everything to themselves because they see everything selfishly. And if you're going to do that to that person, then you could do it to me. And that is terrifying. They want to believe that you can't do that. Of course, we're all capable of doing that, right? But kids need to be protected from that realization and that loss of innocence until later in life. There's a certain threshold that kids have to cross before they're ready to hear that, know that kind of thing. So anyway, by the way, my wound is healing slowly from the dermatologist. He freezed off something on my face, so I don't have a giant zit. Although it's looking pretty stark. Like it's hard to not look at. It's very obvious. I apologize. I thought about putting on like a Band-Aid, but that would look even more noticeable. Should I wear makeup?
Yeah.
Well, because we were having a little cute time together, and it's just nice. It was nice to see. That's toxic.
You should delete that.
I know, I'm going to.
It's just, it feels like something.
I'm not going to blackmail this situation.
Yeah. Well, you
like,
already said it, and you have the right to say it. But like, you should delete it.
Yeah, it's like I'm sick of her getting away scot-free. Like saying like, you know, she was like forced in this relationship, or like I like was a mentally or whatever abusive.
So I don't know if I showed that, but he revealed that there was a time, I think maybe when they got back together, that Natalie professed to him on camera while they were making a cute little selfie video or something, that she wished she had said yes on the altar. Yeah, that makes sense that if you get back together, I mean, Natalie was in love with him, and that love probably lasted beyond the wedding ceremony. And, you know, she had some ups and downs. She went back and forth around that. So did he. And then Shayne called her toxic because of that. And I don't understand that. The other thing that I think it's interesting to contrast this or compare this to where he was right after the wedding when there was a no, right? He just seems, when things are going bad for him, when he's rejected, when he's hurt, I think he goes to a perspective of, why am I to blame? You know, how come it's all about me and it's never about her? He's been having that hypothesis and that stance throughout this whole interview. And I'm guessing if Natalie were here, because she has essentially said this, that she would say, I'm not saying you're completely to blame. I'm saying I have problems too. I'm just saying I don't think we're compatible for each other, and I'm sorry. I'm not secretly thinking it's all your fault. I just don't think we're a good match. I'm guessing that's what she would say, particularly if she was in a differentiated spot. But I think for Shayne, he has a schema that when he is being rejected, he's being unfairly accused of something because maybe that happened to him a lot prior to Natalie. It just has that flavor. Because remember, right, it was much more noticeable right after the wedding. I just remember him saying like, "How come it's all about me?" And he was just kind of frantically saying these things. And Natalie's like, "Well, you did say I was the worst thing that ever happened to you, or whatever." And you did say you hated me the other night. So I don't. Am I just supposed to think that's fine? Like I'm considering those things that happened the other night in my. Just makes me wonder if this is. I don't want to be treated like that. And so, and then he would feel ashamed but I don't understand. This is your fault. And I think that perspective is, maybe it's just a step along the way to recovery. It's interesting to learn that, according to Shayne, they just broke up again for the 5th time, and he's a little raw about it. All right, well, that does it for that episode. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself, because you deserve it. You really, really do.